Right, assessing past and present experiential learning in the context of work-based learning. Hello everybody, and I'm very sorry that I can't be with you at the moment, but the invitation to come and speak to you came after I'd already accepted an invitation to go to France, so this is why you're having something pre-recorded. And I suppose the other thing I have to apologise for is I'm not entirely sure what it is that you want. So what I'm doing is, may be more information than you're actually interested in, but of course, because this is pre-recorded, you can always fast forward and skip over bits which aren't so interesting to you. There's three topics. The other thing I should say also is there's a transcript of this presentation which you're welcome to have. There are also a couple of documents which I refer to, which again, you're also welcome to have sight of. Right, I'm going to talk about three topics. First of all, past learning and its assessment of credit. Second, the varieties of work-based learning which exist, because I'm not entirely sure what the range of practice is in Ireland. I've got some idea, thanks to a paper that I've already seen, but I need to say something about the varieties of practice, and then finally I'm going to say something about the way, some of the ways in which you can assess current experiential learning. I should also say that I'm going to talk about some of the practice that we engage in Chester, but also I'll be drawing on wider literature. Right, just to begin talking about past learning, there's various terms which are used for it, and I'm not sure which terms you use. We, in the UK, we're kind of divided between accreditation for past learning and recognition of past learning. But Americans call it prior learning assessment. It's sometimes called validation of non-formal and informal learning. Sometimes it's called credit transfer. There are various terms which are used to describe the practice of giving credit for past learning. Practice itself is quite scattered around the world. Probably the countries which do it to the greatest extent are France and the USA, where they both started doing it in the 1930s, so they've had a bit of a head start on the rest of us, although they have quite a different approach to practice in both of those countries. The US, it starts really after John Dewey. It doesn't really get going until after the war, when there's lots of GIs coming out with certificates from the army, but they don't have college credits, so there's a big boost to practice then. There's then also a big boost to practice in the 1960s and the Civil Rights Movement, where it's seen as a way of empowering non-traditional learners. In similar ways in South Africa. South Africa's got quite a strong tradition of recognition of past learning because it was seen as a way of overcoming the iniquities of apartheid. In the UK, practice is largely confined to work-based learning departments, and I'll say a little bit about, because I think our work-based learning departments in some ways are different from those in your country. But also in health faculties, there's quite often recognition of past learning. Recent years, we've seen a big push from international bodies like UNESCO, the World Bank, OECD, European Union, because it's seen as an important aspect of lifelong learning and economic development. Past learning can be used for admissions purposes. It can also be used for partial completion of a formal award, or in some cases it can be used for the completion of a whole award. So in France, for example, you have a statutory right to go to any university and ask for your professional experience to be translated into a formal academic award. But I'll come back to past learning and its assessment later. I want to now move on and talk a little bit about work-based learning. one of the problems with work-based learning is it kind of means whatever anybody wishes it to mean. It's used in all sorts of contexts and ways. The term has gone global, and it sort of sits alongside other terms such as work-related learning, work-integrated learning, work-applied learning, these other things. And it's part of a global movement towards education which has got greater relevance for the workplace, which has really started from the 1990s onwards. Simplest definition, work-based learning, this is from UNESCO. Work-based learning refers to all forms of learning that take place in a real work environment. So I'm just going to move on and say a little bit about the context in which it can occur. It can occur in higher education. I'm working in a work-based learning higher education context. I'm not sure if you are. But in some countries, it's mostly sub-higher education. For example, in Wales, there's a network of 100 organisations engaged in work-based learning, all learning levels 1 to 3. I think it's useful to make a distinction between the three types of learning which it can incorporate, and again I'll refer back to these. First is the idea of informal learning. That's day-to-day, unplanned, incremental learning, the sort of thing that you learning on the job that occurs for all of us over our working lives. Secondly, non-formal learning. Non-formal learning is structured and planned, but it's not credit rated or part of a formal award. So it might be in-house company training. Lots of people do short training programs. It could be CPD as part of a requirement for a professional body, or even completion of a MOOC. And then the sort of learning, third form of learning, which we're more familiar with, is formal learning. And this is the learning which occurs within accredited institutions. It's structured, planned, and confers credit. Right, I'm also now, having made those distinctions, I'm going to just briefly describe the varieties of work-based learning practice as I understand them. Anyway, there's various definitions, but the way that I've approached it is in relation to the relationship of the learner to the labour market. First type of work-based learning is for people who are outside the labour market, and that includes full-time students who are studying prior to entry into the labour market, which I suspect is probably where most of you are at. That's your type of work-based learning. But then there is also work-based learning aimed at older people who are excluded from the labour market, perhaps after being made redundant. So work-based learning in this sense is a mechanism really to enable people to compete effectively in the labour market and so enter the workplace. Pedagogic methods, work placements, mentoring, internments, and simulations, that sort of thing. So it's a sort of pre-employment skills development approach. There's also a sort of subset of work-based learning programs in relation to this, because most students who are doing this kind of work-based learning are enrolled full-time. But there's an awful lot of students who are enrolled full-time these days who've got part-time jobs. So there is a type of work-based learning which is designed to capture the learning that notionally full-time students have from their part-time work. So that's the first type of work-based learning. Second type is where the learner is partly in the workplace and partly in a formal educational setting. And this is the way that the European Union defines work-based learning. Essentially, it means apprenticeships in a European context. And again, it's a very common form of work-based learning. Apprenticeships, I'm not sure what the situation is in Ireland in respect of apprenticeships. You may know that we've got a big push towards apprenticeships in the UK as a result of from last year a levy, which is every company with a turnover of more than £3 million has to pay. I think it's 0.5% of turnover. For which in exchange they get educational vouchers, which they can exchange for an apprenticeship program at a recognised educational institution. So in this form of work-based learning, there's the student is mostly in the workplace, but there is formal learning in a structured way, and apprenticeships tend to last several years rather than the sort of 3 years for a bachelor degree or what have you. And most often the apprentice is considered an employee and has got a work contract and a salary. Traineeships, internship, workplace training periods complement formal or non-formal education and training programs. So that's the second type of work-based learning. I said I'm not sure if you're engaged in this type of work-based learning. Third type, and this is the type that we principally engaged in Chester, and I'm not sure this type of work-based learning exists in Ireland. And this is work-based learning for those who are already in work. And the purpose here is to enable learners to gain formal qualifications for their non-formal and informal learning, update their professional skills, and translate into a formal educational qualification. The curriculum, because it's aimed at adults, is determined by the requirements of the learner in the workplace rather than a more traditional approach to the construction of a curriculum. There are various pedagogic methods used in this kind of work-based learning, varying from corporate, what we would call at Chester, corporate programs. This is where the modules are subject discipline modules, but they're agreed with an employer and delivered by the university or educational institution. To the sort of thing that we mostly do, which is whole program learning by contract for individuals or cohorts who negotiate their own studies tailored to their particular requirements. And programs like this incorporate extensive use of recognition of prior learning, accreditation of prior learning, and also current experiential learning. Again, I'll say more about this in future. This form of work-based learning is derived from, some of you may be familiar with Boone Solomon's 2001 book, A New Higher Education, about work-based learning. Work-based learning in this sense is a partnership between the university and those in work to create learning opportunities in the workplace. Learners are employees or otherwise engaged in the labour market. The programme of learning is derived from the needs of the workplace, and the content and level of the programme is determined by the ability and requirements of the learner, not their formal qualifications. Active learning projects occur in the workplace as part of the programme, and assignments are transdisciplinary, and assessment occurs with reference to accepted academic standards. Just a little bit about that term transdisciplinary, if you're not familiar with it. You'll be familiar with the idea of disciplinary learning, interdisciplinary learning, where there's more than one discipline involved. Transdisciplinarity is a body of knowledge which includes disciplinary knowledge, but also non-disciplinary knowledge. So the sort of knowledge that, for example, that you have about how to run a university or a college is not necessarily knowledge which is formally codified within a subject discipline, but it's practice knowledge nonetheless, and extremely important. So work-based learning in this sense goes beyond the traditional boundaries of subject discipline learning in education. The usual mechanism for delivering this kind of work-based learning, as I said, it's a form of learning by contract, is what's known as a shell framework. A shell framework, and I'm sorry about this, I'm going to read out a definition which I wrote myself because I couldn't find one. It's a form of whole program learning contract designed specifically to meet the requirements of adults in the workplace. They are validated programs created by an accredited educational body which enables learners, either individually or in cohorts, to negotiate their curriculum and in some cases award title relevant to their professional practice. In contrast to a traditional validated program of study, a shell framework does not begin with the assumption that the objective of learning is instruction in a predetermined subject. Instead, it regards the subject of study a matter for negotiation between the learner and the educational body, so that the learner is able to devise a curriculum and a method which is relevant to their specific requirements. The purpose of study is to help them obtain a relevant qualification, receive recognition for their existing learning, and develop personally and professionally. Shell frameworks can be for full or short awards, either transdisciplinary or within a subject discipline. There are many ways, the polar opposite of the compulsory core curriculum for all. So that's the definition that I came up with. Right, I'm going to switch a little bit now and talk about assessing past learning. And I need to make a distinction about assessment because there are two types of assessment for past learning. First is what's known as assessment of past learning for generic credit. And this is where the learning is, or the claim for learning is broadly compatible with the learning outcomes of the program. So it doesn't have to be tailored to a particular module or set of modules within a curriculum, but is broadly consistent with the learning outcomes for the whole program. Now, this is obviously, and I should say one of the barriers to greater uptake of assessing or awarding credit for past learning is our learning outcomes. Learning outcomes are very specific, and they say what a learner must do. And the problem is that they're rarely written in such a way as to encompass the experience that people bring in, which tends to, it's in all sorts of things all over the place. But if somebody, for example, is completing a management degree, and the learning outcomes for the program are broadly written so that it can incorporate experience, there's no reason why a chunk of that program can be awarded for what's, as I said, is known as generic credit. It's much easier to make an award for generic credit when you have a shell framework. And that's simply because you can design the learning outcomes in such a way that they are able to easily accommodate people's experience. So that's generic credit. More commonly, past learning is used for specific credit. And specific credit is where somebody's past learning is compatible with the learning outcomes for a specific module or modules. And that's where the difficulty tends to arise because, as I say, learning outcomes are quite specific and people's experience often doesn't accord with the learning outcomes for the module. Right, I'm going to say the other form of past learning, of course, is, we're kind of talking about informal and non-formal learning, but there's also the issue of where people have credit from another program, and this is sometimes referred to as credit transfer, where somebody brings in credit from one program into another. In our terms, we call it accreditation of prior certificated learning. The credit, again, has to be compatible with the program learning outcomes and the module learning outcomes at the appropriate level and must be comparable in terms of the volume of learning. Volume of learning we normally demonstrate by notional learning hours. And of course the other issue is it has to be current as well. You can't bring current credit in from a program which is, say, 15 years old when the state of knowledge has moved on considerably. I'm not sure what you do in your own institutions in this respect. Within my institution, current knowledge means current formal knowledge. Or something bearing credit means it must have been obtained within the last 5 years. I mean, and what we do, if it's more than 5 years old, but it is consistent with everything else, then we set an exercise for the student to demonstrate currency, either by means of reflective review, demonstrating application. So they've learnt these things in a formal setting. How have they applied them? Or update the formal knowledge so that they just bring it up to date. So that's the way we do it. I don't know except what you do in your institutions. Right, how do we award credit for informal and non-formal learning? Assessment of prior experiential learning or recognition of prior experiential learning. There are essentially two models, two means of achieving this. First is known as the credit exchange model, and the second is the developmental model. These terms go back to a paper written by Butterworth in 1992. In the credit exchange model, the student prepares a portfolio of evidence as the basis for a claim. It may or may not be accompanied by a written review or summary. Assessment may be on the basis of the portfolio only, or there may be some sort of critical dialogue with a panel or a tutor. In many cases, the composition of the panel, because it's quite difficult to equate a portfolio with learning outcomes and learning levels and all of these other things, the panel itself is often has tutors, subject specialists. There may be senior members of the awarding body or institution present to ensure that that it's worthy of an award. And this is essentially, I've spoken about France. This is essentially, as I said, everybody in France has a legal right to take time off or to be given time in the workplace to make a claim, to be able to obtain a whole award. They go to the university, they are given guidance on how to prepare a portfolio, and then they go before a panel with senior members of the university, subject specialists and all the rest of it, and then they make a decision about whether an award should be made. And I think the portfolio method is overwhelmingly the method used by most of the world. It's essentially what they do in the States. And it's, in my opinion, it's well suited for technical disciplines, especially like engineering, where you're more interested in competency. It's probably also quite suitable at learning levels 1 to 3, sub-higher education. And it's a very good way to reward years of practical experience with an award where this is possible. But the method does have its drawbacks. As I said, it's very difficult to equate a portfolio with academic learning outcomes and volume of credit and so on. And I've used this method in the past at another university, and we used to have this. People would bring in carrier bags full of all sorts of things, which we put on the table and sit around and try and decide what we thought it was worth and what it was we were actually looking at. So it isn't very easy always to tell from a portfolio exactly how it equates to all of those wonderful things we have in the European qualifications framework, and it's also extremely difficult to exercise external oversight. It's very difficult for an external examiner to come in and look at a pile of, as I said, could be carrier bags, and make a judgment as to whether the process is rigorous. The other problem with it is that if somebody makes a claim at the beginning of their study and it's essentially on the basis of a portfolio, it's not easy for that student then to transition onto a more academic aspect of the program because they're not really given the preparation in the portfolio claim. So the second method, the development model method, is less concerned with the portfolio and more concerned with the student demonstrating learning from the experience, which is why it's called the development model. Credit exchange, you're simply saying, you've done this, therefore we give you this. Development model is much more about, you've done this, what have you learned? And then we can assess that learning. Students have to be introduced to theories of learning because they have to be conscious of how they've learned and what they've learned. And they therefore are sensitised to the idea of planned active learning from lived experience. So it should, if it works properly, it should inculcate the idea of self-directed, reflective and lifelong learning. The other issue is that certainly at Chester, we don't simply award credit for learning which is unschooled, if you like. We expect, if a student is saying that they're making a claim for leadership on the basis of being the chief executive officer or something for so many years, we would expect that student to have some understanding of the literature, whether it's theoretical, empirical or professional. And we expect some sort of dialogue between the student's experience and the literature that they read. So they are asked to engage in a formal academic exercise of learning, which again we hope prepares them for further study. If there is a problem with it, I guess I know that I've heard engineers complain about this because engineers, on the whole, are not very good at writing essays, and in any case, it's more important that they demonstrate competence rather than learning. From our perspective, as I said, people who are engaged in the development model, we tend to think that we're not competent to judge competence. Who judges that somebody's competent is not somebody sitting in a university or a college, but it's actually the people that person works with. We can assess their learning because we can see the intellectual journey from what they did, how they analysed, what they'll do in future. But who's to say? Who are we to say that that person is competent? But there is, like everything, there are swings and roundabouts with this. Right, I'm just going to say a little bit now about the practice that we have, how we assess past learning, and I can send you guidance on this because we give the students quite detailed guidance on writing a reflective review. It's pretty prescriptive. The review always begins with a brief description of the experience, which is then cross-referenced with, there is a portfolio, but it's in the form of an appendix, and it's at the back of it's attached to the reflective review, and we ask the students to keep it short. We don't want carrier bags full of this, that and the other. And it's essentially simply, the portfolio is there simply to evidence the basis for the claim. So it could be a letter of appointment, a job description, some emails, a management report, something like that. Or if somebody's making a claim for past learning on the basis of completing a MOOC program, it could be the certificate they gain from the automated assessment. So the review said the first part is, the first sentence is always something like, this is a claim for 20 credits at level 4 for whatever. So it's very clear to everybody and especially external examiners, they have to understand what it's for. And then said brief description of what the student has done. The bulk of the review is taken up with an analysis of the experience. Students, and we have to ask students to select and break down their experience. So we advise them to consider the skills and competences which they've acquired in relation to the award title and programme learning outcomes that they've negotiated with us. And the processes by which they were acquired. Did they learn to become a team member through reading about it formally? Did they go on a course non-formally, or did they learn about it informally, or is it a combination of these things? And then as I said, they're required to refer to formal literature as a means of examining their lived experience. So in addition to being directed to the literature on reflective and experiential learning, they have guidance from the tutors on, if the claim is in relation to team working, go off and read Belbin or whatever it is, and how does with a mind to enabling them to deepen and sharpen up their life experiences. So we're coming from the I don't know if you've come across W. Deeming Edwards at all. Wonderful quote: "Experience alone teaches us nothing. You need dialogue with other people. You need to read around to make sense of what's happened to you." All right. So having analysed their experience, the final part of the analysis requires the student to look forward and to anticipate their further professional development and the learning that's required to do so. And we ask them to think about the stage of development they think they are, perhaps using, I'm not sure again if you're familiar with the Dreyfus model of skill acquisition, which goes from novice to mastery. So a self-assessment exercise. How good are you at this stage? The reflective review, the word count is half that for a normal submission. Assessment is on pass-fail basis only. Under our regulations at the university, up to 2/3 of a named award can be granted for past learning. But if you were using it in a bachelor degree, for example, you'd only be able to use it levels 4 and 5, and 6. Level 6 would have to be entirely new learning, so that an award classification is always based upon new learning rather than your past learning. I think that's sorry, I'm kind of reading through this. Right, so the advantage of the method is that the assessor no longer has to make judgments about the portfolio. Instead, the assessment is broadly comparable to any other academic assessment. And the assessor, we're not having to make judgments about competence. The assessment is simply on the basis of learning as demonstrated by the student. And for the student itself, the writing of the reflective review should be a learning experience, because they're being asked to formally assess things which have happened to them in the workplace. And they're developing the academic skills which are necessary for further study. Right, final part of this, I'm just going to talk about the assessment of current experiential learning. Now, where work-based learning is part of a traditional program, as a work placement, for example, there are usually have fixed learning outcomes against which the student is assessed. What I'm going to briefly outline is the alternative, where the learning outcomes are negotiable. In other words, you have a template with generic learning outcomes which are consistent with the learning level, which you then tailor to the particular circumstances of the student. So this is another form of learning by contract. The advantage of having negotiable learning outcomes, of course, is that the student's experience, which is often diverse, is accommodated. And by involving the student in the writing of their own learning outcomes, ideally with the placement provider, both are sensitised to the learning which is supposed to occur. I think one of the important things that we've learnt over the years is that effective work-based learning, you have to get away from the idea that it's about the individual doing something on themselves, that learning isn't simply something that happens in the head of the individual, but it's part of a broader social process. So we always like our students to discuss what they're doing with their employer, in particular their line manager, and to discuss with them the projects that they undertake. So a really good work-based project is one which becomes part of the everyday work experience of the student. It's simply a part of their job, but they're formally learning and getting academic credit for it. There are problems with it. Very few standards are able to write learning outcomes to a professional standard, as you might imagine. I mean, a lot of academic tutors struggle to write learning outcomes. So the template is there to help, but usually there's an awful lot of tutor input into writing the learning outcomes, and they also have to specify the learning, the reading that they're going to engage in, what they're trying to achieve, and so on. But you can see that from the template. So, and then it's simply assessed in the way that you would any other academic assignment, in that, having agreed a submission date, the student submits, and then we assess according to normal assessment criteria. One aspect of our practice, which may not be a part of your practice, is we use formative assessment quite extensively. So we will sit down with the student at the point where they're designing the workplace project, so because that's what they're going to be assessed against, and so we're helping them to plan the work, but we also encourage the students to submit a draft, which we then and the idea is really to help the student develop. I mean, it's a sort of philosophical thing with us, because for us, assessment isn't. It's partly a grading exercise, but it's principally a learning exercise. The point where the student writes their assignment, creates their assignment, is the point for us where the learning is really occurring. So the formative assessment is designed to help the student progress and develop along the way. Right, okay, I've spoken. I think I was asked to speak for about 30 minutes, and I'm not sure how long. It's about 30 minutes, Lee? Something like that, yeah. So that's pretty much it. And I'm sorry I've sort of kept looking away, because I've got a computer in front of me, and I'm sorry I'm not there to answer questions. But good luck with the rest of your. I think it's a workshop or seminar, and I hope it all goes very well for you. Thanks very much.